The finality was not in the words, but in the silence that followed them. Alara stood on the worn oriental rug in the study, a place that smelled of her grandfather's pipe tobacco and old paper, and listened to the house die around her. Marcus, her stepfather of 3 years, did not look at her. He studied a file on the polished mahogany desk, his fingers drumming a soft, administrative tattoo. He was a man who saw life as a series of ledgers to be balanced, and she, apparently, was the final, untidy entry in this one. "The sale is complete," he said, his voice as dry as dust. "The new owners take possession on the 1st. You have until then." He slid a small, thin envelope across the desk. "Your mother would have wanted you to have something to start with. Consider it a final settlement." Alara did not take it. She looked at the wall behind him, at the framed survey maps her grandfather, Silas, had drawn by hand. Each line was a testament to a life spent walking the earth, understanding its contours, its hidden strengths, and secret weaknesses. He had taught her that world. He had put the tools in her hands, the adze and the froe, the compass and the saw. He had taught her how to read the grain in a piece of wood, the story in a stone, the direction of true north in a starless sky. His lessons were the only real inheritance she possessed. "Where am I to go?" The question was quiet, a ghost in the room. It held no plea, only a need for data. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes a pale, disinterested blue. "That is no longer my concern. You are 22, Alara. You are an adult." He gestured to the envelope. "That is more than most receive." She knew what was inside without looking. A paltry sum, an insult wrapped in the pretense of charity. It was the price of her erasure. She picked it up. The paper felt thin and brittle. She did not cry. She did not plead. Her grandfather had taught her that competence was a shield, and that grief was a private, quiet thing, to be tended like a low fire. She walked out of the study, leaving Marcus to his balanced ledgers. For the next 3 days, she moved through the house like a phantom, sorting not furniture or heirlooms, but memories, the scent of pine resin in the workshop, the satisfying heft of a well-balanced hammer, the particular groan of the 3rd step on the stairs. These were the things she was losing. She packed a single canvas satchel. Into it went a change of sturdy clothes, a block of soap, a small sack of flour and salt, and the tools that were her true birthright. A small, keen-edged adze, a folding saw with teeth she had sharpened herself, a whetstone, smooth and gray, and last, wrapped in oiled leather, she placed the heart of her grandfather's work, a heavy, brass plumb bob. It was perfectly symmetrical, its point still needle-sharp, its weight a dense, comforting promise of truth. On its worn leather thong, it was more than a tool. It was a compass for the soul, a reminder that the world had a center, even if she had lost hers. On the morning of the 1st, she walked out the back door, leaving the key on the kitchen table. She did not look back at the house that had been built by her great-grandfather, a fortress of love and competence that had fallen not to a siege, but to a signature on a deed. She walked north, toward the rugged, unforgiving spine of the mountains, a place where the land was honest, and a person was judged not by their name, but by the work of their hands. The small envelope from Marcus was tucked deep in her pocket, a cold, rectangular weight against her leg. The journey was a blur of dust and sun. She walked for days, her boots kicking up the fine, pale dirt of the road that dwindled slowly into a track, and then a trail. She ate sparingly, slept rolled in a single blanket under the vast, indifferent canopy of stars, and spoke to no one. The grief she had held at bay began to seep into the edges of her resolve. It was a cold, heavy thing, much heavier than the plumb bob in her pack. Her grandfather had always said that the best way to fight sorrow was with sweat. You worked until your back ached and your hands were raw, and then you were too tired for anything but sleep. But with no work to do, the sorrow had space to grow. She felt adrift, a ship with no rudder, no port of call. She arrived in the town of Provisional, a name that perfectly suited its slapdash collection of unpainted buildings huddled against the wind. It was a territorial outpost, the last stop before the wilderness truly began. Its air smelled of coal smoke, manure, and the faint, metallic tang of desperation. In the dusty land office, a place of curling maps and fly-specked windows, she sat on a bench, nursing a cup of lukewarm water and trying to form a plan. That was when she heard the laughter. Two men stood at the main counter, one a portly land agent with a sweat-stained collar, the other a lean prospector in dusty buckskins. "Sold it, you say, Finch?" The prospector rasped, a grin splitting his weathered face. "To who? Some greenhorn from the east with more money than sense?" Finch, the agent, chuckled, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Worse. The territory is just letting it go for the back taxes. Figure it's cheaper than posting a warning sign. The old Cinderwood Fort. Can you imagine? A pile of charcoal and cursed rock." "Cursed is right," the prospector agreed. "Place burned hot enough to scare the devil himself. Thorne, the fellow who built it, vanished in the flames. They say his ghost still walks the ruins, looking for his gold." "Ghost wouldn't find anything but ash," Finch said dismissively. "It's worthless. 150 acres of burnt timber and bad memories. Costs more to clear it than the land's worth." He gestured to a large, leather-bound book on the counter. "Right there. Lot 73. $112. Alara's hand went to her pocket. She pulled out the envelope. She had not opened it, but she could feel the faint outlines of the bills inside. She walked to the counter, her worn boots making little sound on the grimy floorboards. The men fell silent, turning to look at her. "Lot 73, she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "I'll buy it." Finch stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The prospector let out a low whistle. A slow, cruel smile spread across Finch's face. The humor of the situation was not lost on him. It was the perfect punchline to his joke. "You got the money, girl?" he asked, his tone thick with condescension. Alara opened the envelope and carefully counted out the bills. $112, the exact amount. The final, insulting settlement from Marcus was the precise price of a pile of ash and a ghost story. It felt like a strange, bitter sort of poetry. She pushed the money across the counter. The transaction was brief. Finch filled out the deed with a flourish, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. He clearly relished the absurdity of it all. He didn't ask her name, just wrote "purchaser" on the relevant line. As he handed her the stiff official paper, he leaned forward, a conspiratorial smirk on his face. "Good luck with your grand investment," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Try not to get burned." Alara took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her satchel. She met his mocking gaze with a steady, unblinking stare that she had learned from her grandfather. It was a look that said, "I see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." She turned and walked out of the land office, the prospector's disbelieving chuckle following her into the dusty street. She had a destination now. She had a place. It might be worthless, it might be cursed, but it was hers. The map Finch had given her was a crude sketch, but Silas had taught her topography. The confluence of two rivers, a sharp rise in elevation, a stand of old-growth pine to the west. She found her way not by the ink on the page, but by the language of the land itself. It took another 2 days of hard walking, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind. The air grew cleaner, sharper, scented with pine and damp earth. The silence was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees and the cry of a distant hawk. She crested a low ridge and saw it. The sight stole the air from her lungs. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. The word "fort" was a grand lie. What remained was a skeleton. The charred black bones of massive timbers clawed at the sky, stark against the deep green of the surrounding forest. The walls were jagged heaps of blackened stone, tumbled down as if by a giant, angry hand. The roof was gone, and the sky looked down into the ruin with a cold, gray eye. A profound and chilling stillness hung over the place, the silence of a tomb. The smell was still there, decades later. The faint, acrid tang of ancient smoke, trapped in the porous stone and charcoal-black earth. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The mockery of the men in the land office echoed in her ears. What had she done? She had traded the last of her money for a scar on the landscape. This was not a foundation upon which to build. It was a grave. She sank to the ground, the rough grass pricking at her hands, and for the first time since leaving her grandfather's house, she felt the hot sting of tears. But she did not let them fall. Crying was a luxury, and this land offered no luxuries. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the despair down. Competence was a shield. Work was a cure. She stood up, slung her satchel from her shoulder, and began to walk the perimeter of the ruin. Her grandfather's voice was a low murmur in her memory. Always know your ground, Ilara. Understand what it holds, what it can bear, before you drive a single nail. She was a surveyor of her own desolation. The main trading post building had been enormous, a testament to some forgotten ambition. The stonework, where it still stood, was masterful. The stones were cut and fitted with a precision she recognized, a skill that spoke of patience and deep knowledge. This Thorn, the man who had supposedly died in the fire, had been a builder. Behind the main structure, built into the rising slope of the hill, was what looked like a collapsed storage shed. But as she picked her way through the debris, she saw it was more. The walls were thick, double-laid stone, and the roof, though covered in earth and fallen timbers, seemed to be made of heavy, arched stone as well. It was a root cellar, built for strength and insulation. She cleared the entrance, her hands soon raw from pulling at thorny vines and heaving aside blackened planks. The heavy wooden door had burned away, but the stone frame was intact. She peered into the darkness. It smelled of cool earth, dampness, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. It was not a home, but it was shelter. It was a start. She spent the rest of the day clearing it out, sweeping the packed earth floor with a pine bough, her movements methodical, rhythmic. As she worked, the crushing weight of despair began to lift, replaced by the simple, grounding reality of physical labor. The cellar was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, but it was solid. The stone walls were cool and dry to the touch. In the back wall, a small ventilation shaft provided a trickle of fresh air. This would be her refuge, her first foothold in this desolate place. That night, she built a small fire just outside the entrance and ate a meager meal of flour mixed with water, cooked on a hot stone. The flames cast dancing shadows against the ruined walls of the trading post, making the charred timbers look like grasping fingers. The ghost story did not frighten her. The dead were quiet company. It was the living she had learned to fear. The next morning, she began the real work, clearing the main foundation. It was a monumental task. The floor of the great room had been made of massive flagstones, but they were now buried under a thick, compacted layer of ash, charcoal, and debris from the collapsed roof. She worked with a shovel she fashioned from a broad piece of timber and her small adze, slowly, methodically, clearing one small section at a time. The sun beat down, and the black ash coated her skin and clothes, filling her nose and throat. It took her a week to clear a 10-foot square section near the great stone hearth that dominated one wall. The hearth itself was a masterpiece of masonry, a towering structure of river stone and granite that had survived the inferno almost unscathed. As she swept the last of the fine, gray ash from the flagstones, she paused, leaning on her shovel. Something was wrong. She walked across the newly cleared stones, her boots echoing slightly in the ruin. She felt it before she saw it. a subtle difference in the vibration beneath her feet. Most of the stones were solid, seated deep in the earth. But here, in the corner formed by the hearth and the main wall, they felt different. There was a faint hollowness to the sound they made. She knelt, running her hand over the surface. The stones here were smoother, their edges more tightly fitted, and the ash she had just cleared from this spot, it had been different too. Finer, almost like cement dust, and in places it seemed fused to the stone, as if it had been subjected to an intense, localized heat far greater than a simple wood fire. She remembered the prospector's words. Burned hot enough to scare the devil himself. She took out her grandfather's plumb bob. She let it hang, its brass point hovering just inches from the stone. It was perfectly still, a small, golden point of absolute truth in a world of ruin. She tapped the stone beside it with the handle of her adze. Thud. A solid, earthy sound. She moved the plumb bob and tapped the stone in the corner. Thunk. A hollow, resonant sound, full of empty space. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This was not random chance. This was design. This was a secret. Using the sharp edge of the adze, she began to scrape at the tight seam between two of the stones. It was not mortar. It was a fine, hard-packed mixture of sand and something else, something metallic. It took her an hour of painstaking work to clear the seam along one edge of a large, rectangular stone. She needed a lever. She found a long, solid timber among the ruins, char-blackened but still strong. Bracing one end against the base of the hearth, she worked the other into the seam she had cleared. She put all her weight on it. The timber groaned. Sweat beaded on her forehead, tracing clean lines through the grime on her face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grating scrape of stone on stone, the flagstone moved. It shifted only an inch, but it was enough. She worked the lever again, her muscles screaming in protest. The stone lifted, tilting upwards, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable darkness beneath. The air that rose from the opening was cool and stale, the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very long time. She pushed the heavy stone slab all the way over. It fell to the side with a deafening crash that echoed through the silent valley. She peered into the hole. A stone-lined shaft descended into the earth. Heavy iron rungs were set into one wall, disappearing into the black. Her hands trembled slightly as she lit the small lantern she owned. The flame sputtered, then grew steady, casting a warm, golden glow. She lowered it into the shaft. The light revealed a small, dry chamber about 10 feet below. It was walled with the same expertly fitted stone as the hearth, a vault hidden in plain sight, and inside, reflecting the lantern light, were the dull, dark shapes of several iron boxes. Beside them lay a single, misshapen parcel, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with tarred rope. She secured her lantern to her belt, took a deep breath, and began to climb down. The iron rungs were cold and rough beneath her hands. The air grew cooler, thicker. When her feet touched the stone floor of the chamber, she unhooked the lantern and held it high. The room was no bigger than her cellar shelter. The 3 iron boxes were heavy and squat, bound with thick iron straps. They were locked. The oilcloth parcel, however, was what drew her eye. It felt impossibly heavy for its size. She set the lantern down and carefully picked up the parcel. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked with age. The tarred rope was brittle. She broke it with her hands. Unfolding the layers of stiff, waterproof fabric, she found a book. It was a thick ledger, bound in dark, worn leather. The cover was unmarked. She sat on the floor of the hidden chamber, the lantern light flickering beside her, and opened it. The first page was a name, written in a precise, elegant script that was at odds with the ruggedness of the place. Elias Thorne. The man who had built the fort. The man who had vanished. The page was dated 50 years prior. She began to read. The ledger was not a diary of daily life, but a record of work, of thought, of secrets. Elias Thorne was not just a trader. He was a master assayer and a metallurgist, a man who understood the secret language of minerals. He wrote of fleeing a partnership in a city back east, of a man named Sterling who had stolen his research, betrayed his trust, and tried to claim his revolutionary refining techniques as his own. Sterling's greed was boundless, and Thorne knew the man would not stop until he had everything, including Thorne's life. So he had vanished. He came to this remote wilderness to build a new life, a place where he could continue his work in secret. He built the trading post, not just as a business, but as a fortress and a laboratory. The great hearth was not just for warmth. It was the housing for a small, custom-built furnace of his own design, capable of reaching temperatures far beyond any normal forge. The entries grew more intense. He wrote of perfecting his process, a method for extracting and refining gold and platinum that was years ahead of its time. He made strike after strike in the small, unmapped creeks of the surrounding mountains, bringing back ore to refine in his secret furnace. The trading post was a front for the most advanced metallurgical operation on the continent. Then came the final entry. The script was hurried, the ink slightly smeared. Sterling's men had found him. He knew they were coming. He had a plan, a final desperate act of defiance. He could not let his work, his fortune, fall into their hands. He wrote of a thermic compound he had created, a substance that would burn with an unimaginable, all-consuming heat. "They believe I hoard coin," he wrote. "The fools. The wealth is not in the metal, but the knowledge. I will give them neither. As they approach, I will trigger the furnace. The compound will melt the crucible, the furnace, and my entire store of refined metal. It will flow down into the bedrock, fusing with the stone itself, a dragon's hoard no common thief can ever claim. Then I will give them the fire they seek, a blaze to scour this place from the earth and cover my escape. My only regret is the destruction of this fine stonework." The last paragraph was addressed to no one and everyone. If you are reading this, then fate has led you here. You must be a person who understands stone and is not afraid of work, or you would never have found this chamber. The legacy is yours. The iron boxes contain my tools, my notes, my formulas. The real treasure is fused into the earth beneath the hearth, a king's ransom for anyone with the skill and patience to extract it. But be warned. Sterling's line is patient and greedy. They may still seek what they believe was lost. Use this knowledge to build, not to hide as I did. Let this place live again. That is my final will and testament." Alara closed the book, her mind reeling. The fire was not an accident. The ruin was not a grave. It was a crucible. The ghost was not a lost soul, but a brilliant man who had turned his life's work into a permanent part of the land. And she, by some impossible twist of fate, was his heir. She looked at the iron boxes, then up at the dark opening of the shaft. She was no longer just an outcast. She had a purpose. She was the steward of a hidden legacy. The next day, she did not return to clearing ash. She climbed the hill behind the ruin, the ledger tucked safely in her satchel. She walked through the forest, her eyes scanning the trees, her hands feeling the texture of the bark. She found what she was looking for, a stand of tall, straight lodgepole pines. Using her folding saw and adze, she began the slow, arduous process of felling them, limbing them, and dragging them down to the site. The work was brutal, but her body was strong, and her mind was filled with a clear, bright purpose. She was not just rebuilding a ruin. She was resurrecting a dream. She followed the sketches she found in the back of Thorne's ledger, designs for a structure that was both elegant and immensely strong. He had planned for everything, from the pitch of the roof to the interlocking joinery of the beams. She broke open the iron boxes, finding not gold, but tools more precious. Specialized tongs, crucibles, calipers of machined brass, and bottles of strange chemical compounds. And his notes, page after page of meticulous calculations and formulas. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The rhythm of her life was the ring of the hammer, the whisper of the saw, the scrape of a trowel on stone. She restacked the fallen walls, stone by careful stone, mixing her own mortar from clay, sand, and ash, a recipe from her grandfather. She hewed the pine logs into massive beams, learning the language of the wood, its stresses and strengths. She did not touch the fused gold beneath the hearth. Thorn was right. The knowledge was the true treasure. The gold was an anchor, a foundation, but the work was the life. Her solitude was eventually broken. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his clothes made of patched animal skins, appeared at the edge of the clearing one day. He watched her for a long time as she set a heavy lintel stone above a window frame. He said nothing, just nodded once, a gesture of profound, silent respect for the labor, and then vanished back into the woods. A few days later, she found a bundle of smoked fish and 3 cured rabbit pelts on her doorstep. This was Jedediah, a trapper who lived his life by the seasons, and he had recognized in her a similar self-reliance. It was the first act of community, an offering made without a single word. Her work required things she could not make herself. She needed nails, hinges, and iron straps for the great roof beams. Her grandfather's tools needed a blacksmith's touch to restore their edges after months of heavy use. With a list drawn from Thorn's notes, she walked the 2 days back to Provisional. The town felt different now. It was no longer a place of last resort, but a place to acquire resources. She found the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town, a squat, soot-stained building from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed. The blacksmith was a man built like his own anvil, with massive arms and a grim, coal-dusted face. His name was Cormac. He glanced at her, then at the tools she laid out on a workbench. "What's this?" he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "I need them dressed," she said simply. "And I need fittings made. I have drawings." He picked up her grandfather's adze, turning it over in his huge hands. He ran a thumb over the worn handle, then sighted down the steel blade. His expression shifted from dismissal to professional interest. He recognized the quality, the balance, the history of honest work held in the tool. He looked at the drawings she unrolled, copies of Thorn's precise technical sketches for the iron straps. "This is fine work," he said, a note of grudging admiration in his tone. "For a girl." "The work doesn't care who does it," Alara replied, meeting his gaze. A slow grin spread across Cormac's face. "No, I suppose it doesn't. This is a month's work. I'll need payment." "I have no coin," she said, "but I know stone. Your chimney flue is cracked. It's drawing poorly. I can rebuild it for you. A fair trade." Cormac stared at her, then looked over his shoulder at the tall, brick chimney of his forge, a dark crack running up its side like a lightning strike. He had been meaning to fix it for a year. He looked back at her, at the quiet competence in her eyes, and nodded slowly. "A fair trade," he agreed. While waiting for Cormac to finish her ironwork, she went to the general store for supplies. The proprietor was a woman named Maeve, sharp-eyed and practical. She watched as Alara carefully selected sacks of flour, beans, salt, and jars of seed. "That's a big order," Maeve noted, tallying the cost. "You starting a settlement out at the Cinderwood place?" "I'm rebuilding," Alara said. Maeve paused, her pen hovering over the ledger. "Finch was through here last month. Said he sold that pile of rocks to some foolish girl. I see he wasn't lying about the girl part, but I'm thinking he was wrong about the fool." She looked at Alara's calloused hands and the quiet determination in her face. "You're good for it. Pay me when you can. Hard work is better currency than coin around here." Alara returned to her land not just with iron and supplies, but with something more, the first threads of a community, woven from mutual respect for skill. She rebuilt Cormac's chimney, her work so solid and true that he simply grunted in approval and handed over the finished ironwork, gleaming and strong. The roof went up, a masterpiece of interlocking beams and trusses. The walls were chinked and sealed. Glass was a luxury she couldn't afford, so she made windows of stretched, oiled hide that cast a warm, amber glow on the inside. The trading post was no longer a ruin. It was a shelter. It was a home. One afternoon, as she was fitting the heavy main door, a horse and rider appeared. It was Finch, the land agent. He reined in his horse, his jaw slack with astonishment as he stared at the resurrected building. The structure that stood before him was not just repaired, it was magnificent, a testament to a vision he could never have imagined. "By the gods," he breathed. He dismounted and walked closer, his eyes scanning the perfect stonework, the massive, soaring roofline. "Where did you get the money for this?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. Alara did not answer. She simply continued her work, using her grandfather's plumb bob to ensure the door was perfectly true. Just then, Cormac and Jedediah emerged from the tree line. Cormac was delivering a new set of custom hinges, and Jedediah was carrying a freshly caught salmon. They flanked her, two silent, imposing figures. Cormac's arms were crossed over his massive chest. Jedediah held his skinning knife loosely in one hand. They said nothing. They didn't have to. Their presence was a statement. She was not alone. She was one of them. Finch saw the look in their eyes. He saw the silent, unshakable solidarity. He saw a world that operated on principles he didn't understand, a world of competence and mutual respect that had no place for his brand of sneering cynicism. He backed away, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word, his face flushed with a humiliation that was far more potent than any verbal rebuke. That winter, the snows came early and with a vengeance. A blizzard descended on the mountains, a howling white wall of wind and ice. Alara was prepared. Her cellar was stocked, her woodpile high. The great stone hearth, the source of the fort's original destruction, was now the source of its life, radiating a deep, steady warmth. One evening, through the roar of the storm, she heard a desperate shout. She unbarred the heavy door and was met with a blast of wind and snow. Through the swirling white, she saw them. Two wagons, stranded in a deep drift, the horses exhausted. A group of settlers, two families with small children, were huddled together, their faces numb with cold. They had tried to cross the pass before the storm hit and had failed. "Please," a man stammered, his beard frozen solid. "We need shelter. The children." "Bring them in," Alara said, her voice calm and clear over the wind's howl. "All of them." For 4 days, the trading post became a sanctuary. The 10 settlers, cold and terrified, thawed out by the warmth of her fire. She fed them from her stores, sharing the food Maeve had advanced her. The children, their fear forgotten, played on the warm flagstones of the floor. The building, born of one man's solitude, now rang with the sounds of a community. It had become what Elias Thorne had hoped for in his final words, a place that lived again. When the storm finally broke, the settlers left with tears of gratitude, promising to return in the spring to trade. They had been the first customers of the new Cinderwood fort. Her act of service had cemented her place not just as a builder, but as the heart of this burgeoning frontier. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the world green. The settlers returned, as did others. Word had spread of the warm, solid trading post at the confluence and the quiet, capable woman who ran it. Trappers, prospectors, and native families came to trade furs, ore, and baskets for flour, tools, and news. Alara's post became a nexus, a vital hub of life in the wilderness. She had fulfilled Thorne's legacy, not by digging up his gold, but by building a community on the foundation of his work. One quiet evening, a year after her arrival, she stood behind the long, smooth counter she had built from a single massive pine, The post was filled with the low murmur of conversation and the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. Maeve was there, delivering supplies. Cormac was arguing with Jedediah about the best way to trap a beaver. Outside, the light of dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and violet. On a shelf behind the counter, two objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's heavy brass plumb bob, its surface polished to a warm glow from the oils of her own hands. The other was a small, intricately carved wooden bird she had found in one of Thorne's iron boxes, a small piece of artistry amidst his scientific precision. The plumb bob was her past, the legacy of skill and truth passed down through blood. The bird was her future, the legacy of purpose passed down through spirit. Together, they represented the two inheritances that had saved her. She looked around at the warm, bustling room, at the faces of the people who had become her family, a community forged not by law or blood, but by the simple, powerful bonds of mutual need and shared respect. She had come here with nothing but a pittance and a handful of tools, an outcast with no future. She had been given a ruin, a pile of ash and bad memories. But her grandfather had taught her that true value is rarely on the surface, and Elias Thorne had taught her that a fire can be both an end and a beginning. The true fortune was never the fused gold waiting silently in the earth beneath her feet. It was the resilience in her hands, the knowledge in her mind, and the unshakable peace in her soul. The insulting sum her stepfather had given her to cast her out had bought her the entire world. It was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.